Good morning, everyone. I am Jerry Jacobs Gonzalez, and I am delighted that you have joined me this morning for me to read an excerpt from one of my very favorite authors, Stephen King. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from The Dark Half. And in this book here, this is a book, like I said, by Stephen King, where the main characters that I'm going to be reading about are Thaddeus Beaumont and George Stark. Now, just some background information about this book. In this book, Thaddeus, as a young child, suffered from really bad headaches, and one time he had a seizure and he fell out at school, and when he went to the hospital, they realized that he had a tumor in his head. And when they went to excise the tumor, they realized that he had an eye, not two nostrils, and two teeth, one of which had a cavity. So what had happened was he was a twin who had absorbed his other twin, which is called fetal absorption. So he grew up and he lived a great normal life. He ended up becoming a really great writer, and he wrote normal, regular books, and then he also had a dark side where he would write macabre type books. And when he wrote books under the pseudonym Alexis Machine when he would write these other books that were not his typical style. And they were really real gruesome and grotesque, but that's my style, so I kind of like that. So I would also like you to please be aware that this is an excerpt from a literary genius in the horror genre, and as such, some of the content will be an element of what she is known for, which is horror. So consider yourself warned. In the passage that I am about to read, George Stark, which is the ghost of the tumor that was removed from Thaddeus Beaumont, has just abducted his family, his wife Liz, and his two children. He has them at his lake house, and Thaddeus has actually conferred with one of his colleagues at a college to find out what could be ailing him, what is haunting him, what is possessing him. So she gives him a bird call whistle. Now I shall begin my reading. He wrote, "The sparrows are flying." Outside, a wind began to blow, only it was no wind. It was the ruffling of millions of feathers, and it was inside Thad's head. Suddenly, that third eye opened in his mind again, opened wider than it had ever been before, and he saw Bergenfield, New Jersey, the empty houses, the empty streets, the mild spring sky. He saw the sparrows everywhere, more than there had ever been before. The world he had grown up in had become a vast aviary, only it wasn't Bergenfield. It was Ennsville. Stark quit writing. Thad drew in a deep breath and blew. The bird call Raleigh had given him uttered a strange, squealing note. "Thad, what are you doing? What are you doing?" Outside, the rustling of the sparrows rose to a roar. They were flying. Both twins were wailing now. Their cries rose, blended with the maddening chirping of the sparrows, and the two of them together made a kind of hell's harmony. "Stop it," Stark yelled. "Stop it, Thad. Whatever the hell you're doing, just stop it." He snatched the gun, and Thad buried the pencil he had been holding in Stark's throat. Blood poured out in a rush. Stark turned towards him, gagging, clawing at the pencil. It bobbed up and down as he tried to swallow. He got one hand around it and pulled it out. "What are you doing?" he croaked. "What is it?" He heard the birds now. He didn't understand them, but he heard them. Thad saw real terror in those eyes for the first time. "I'm writing the end, George," Thad said. "I'm writing the end in the real world." "All right," Stark said. "Well, let's write it for all of us then." He turned towards the twins with the bloody pencil in his hand. Stark felt in his back pocket and brought out the straight razor. He pulled the blade, opened it with his teeth. His eyes sparkled crazily above the steel. "You want it, Hoss?" he asked, and Thad saw the decay falling back into his face, again coming all at once like the dropped load of bricks. "You really do? Okay, you got it." Stark came toward Thad with his razor in his right hand. Thad snatched up the pencil from the desk. "That ain't gonna do you no good, Hoss," Stark said. "Not now." Then his eyes shifted to the door. It had opened wide enough, and sparrows flowed in, a river of them. They flowed at George Stark. In an instant, and his expression had become one of horror and understanding. No, he screamed and began to slash at them with the Lexus machine's straight razor. No, I won't go. I won't go back. You can't make me. He cut one of the sparrows cleanly in half. It fell out of the air in 2 fluttering pieces. Stark ripped and flailed at the air around him, and Thad suddenly understood. I won't go back. What was happening here? The sparrows had come to serve as George Stark's escort back to Ennsville, back to the land of the dead. Thad dropped the pencil and retreated towards his children. The air was filled with sparrows. The door had opened almost all the way now. The river had become a flood. Sparrows settled on Stark's broad shoulders. They settled on his arms, his head. Sparrows stuck his chest, dozens of them at first, then hundreds. He twisted this way and that in a cloud of falling feathers and flashing, slashing beaks, trying to give what they were getting. They covered the straight razor. Its evil silver gleam was gone, buried beneath the feathers that were stuck to it. Thad looked at his children. They had stopped weeping. They were looking up into the stuffed, boiling air with identical expressions of wonder and delight. Their hands were raised as if to check for rain. Their tiny fingers were outstretched. Sparrows stood on them, but they did not peck. But they were pecking Stark. Blood burst from his face in 100 places. One of his blue eyes winked out. A sparrow landed on the collar of his shirt and sent a beak driving into the hole that Thad had made with the pencil in his throat. The bird did it 3 times fast, rat-tat-tat, like a machine gun, before Stark's groping hand seized it and crushed it like a piece of living origami. Thad crouched down between his twins, and the birds lit on him as well, not pecking, just standing and watching. Stark had disappeared. He had become a living, squirming bird sculpture. Blood oozed through the jostling winds and feathers. From somewhere below, Thad heard a streaking, splintering sound, wood giving way. He had began to hear the loose, wet plop and smack of the living flesh being torn off of George Stark's bones. "They've come for you, George," he heard himself whisper. "They've come for you. God help you now." George Stark made one last effort to get away from them. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run, but he tried anyway. It was his style. The column of birds which had covered him moved forward with him. Gigantic puffy arms covered with feathers and heads and wings and rose, beat themselves across his torso, rose again, crossed themselves at the chest. Birds, some wounded, some dead, fell to the floor, and for a moment, Thad was afforded a vision which would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sparrows were eating George Stark alive. His eyes were gone. Where there had been only dark sockets remained. His nose had been reduced to a bleeding flap. His forehead and most of his hair had been struck away, revealing the mucus-bleared surface of his skull. The collar of his shirt still ringed his neck, but the rest were gone. Ribs poked out of his skin in white lumps. The birds had opened his belly. A drove of sparrows sat on his feet and looked up with bright attention and squabbled for his guts as they fell out, dripping, shredded chunks. And he saw something else. The sparrows were trying to lift him. They were trying, and very soon they would do just that after they had reduced his body weight. "Take him then," he screamed. "Take him to hell where he belongs." Stark's screams stopped in his throat. He saw Stark no more.